We're very excited to have Ken today from Wyoming. Ken is one of the most interesting but most innovative people I know. He also created the first global bond. He and his team helped create the first green bond. He helped expand the bank's program, which is to give technical assistance to central banks and sovereign wealth funds from a very small program to a huge program. So whatever he touches, he does very thoughtfully and with great innovation. And on the impact and sustainable investing side, he's been one of the leaders. So Ken, if I may, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the projects you are working on when you're not enjoying this spectacular view in Wyoming and when you're not on an investment committee at Rock Creek?
One of the ideas that we had come up with when I was still at the bank was trying to tackle the problem of avoided deforestation and trying to figure out some ways to offset the opportunity cost that these forest countries would have if they stopped the deforestation. So we've been working now with support from the Rockefeller Foundation and with the World Bank to try to stand up a very large endowment fund to invest long-term to provide these incentives and in effect create a multilateral sovereign wealth fund that would that countries that are successful in avoided deforestation would be able to earn interest in.
Given where we are with COVID, do you find people are more interested in deforestation issues or on the climate-related areas that you're talking about?
What I'm finding is the interest level, I think partly because people are sequestering themselves. There's a lot of I think, incremental thinking going on about all of this. On the other hand, I think it has been difficult, particularly where you're trying to create these new things. It's been particularly difficult to get the kind of easy back and forth that you need sometimes with people face to face to brainstorm solutions. But the folks that I'm talking to remain very, very engaged.
Tell us about where you're living, and you have been engaged on the wind side. And how, one thing is we all believe in climate change, and then when it affects your own neighborhood.
I'm actually very keen on the renewable energy, and as we've seen, the costs of some of the principal solutions, whether it's wind or solar, are coming down. But the issues have to be there's a huge issue in making sure that this is done properly. As you can imagine, siting large-scale renewable energy becomes a complicated issue when you've got some of the longest and most heavily traveled wildlife migration corridors in the world. The other thing that we are beginning to take a look at too is the economic impacts of the transition away from coal. A number of us are trying to figure out how can we affect that transition to a carbon-free energy system without necessarily having to fire everybody. So we're in conversations on small modular nuclear, which could be used to replace the coal-fired generators.
What is your advice on how do we keep on staying entrepreneurial? How do we stay engaged?
This is, I think, is crucial in some respects. I met a very dynamic, very tremendous manager and thinker, Gene Rotberg, who was the treasurer of the World Bank at the time. And I always enjoy quoting Jessica Einhorn, who all of us know, who used to say, "Oh, you remember how much fun we had working for Gene?" And then she'd go on and say, "We could yell at him until he changed his mind." Well, in big organizations like the World Bank, that's rare. And what that did was to create an environment in which, on the one hand, you're engaged on some of these big, crucial issues. And on the other hand, you've got someone who is willing to say, okay, you guys are going to develop these solutions. And, I'm going to reward you if you try stuff that is rational. But even if it doesn't work, we want to encourage that kind of innovation. So I think that's a very important part of the setting.
There are now these social bonds. Ford Foundation just did $1 billion bond. Doris Duke did 100 million. Some other foundations are doing these social bonds. There are a lot of small foundations also that are thinking of issuing bonds, but they have no idea how to go about it. And they'll probably be, taken to the cleaners if every small foundation wanted to do their own bond issue. Do you see any great source of advice? What would be your advice?
For one thing, it's fascinating to see what has evolved with the idea that you can, in effect, leverage the philanthropy this way. And I think that's an important idea. Again, you take a look at what is your target market? Well, if you're trying to raise cost-effective investment grade fixed income for these activities, then we know what that takes. It takes a certain amount of scale to achieve liquidity. It takes a credit worthiness that is going to sustain a BBB credit rating or better. For very large issuers, that they can in principle do that themselves, or they can structure other transactions that will attract cost-effective finance from impact investors, for example. For smaller foundations, you could easily envision establishing a financing facility in which a number of them would participate, which would diversify the risk, create the scale so that they could achieve market liquidity. And I think that it's fascinating. And I think in this current low interest rate environment, it's very difficult. It's hard to come up with a reason why you wouldn't try to do this, because it would still enable you to, in effect, lever your endowment to get greater scale in your activity.
Ken, I have a very quick question for you. Obviously, we watched closely, many of us have worked closely with you as you have developed the global bond and the green bond and the like. But if one looks at the objectives of the global bond, it was to make the market more efficient, much like what you said. And I think that has been achieved. But if you look at a green bond, would the objective have been to really improve or increase the total commitment to green activities, quote unquote, use those bonds? And the question is, in your opinion, has that been realized?
Yeah, and I don't think it has to the potential that we had hoped. This is a rapidly developing area. I do think as asset owners begin to reconcile this issue about their fiduciary, you think about ERISA, for example, where there's been a back and forth about whether the fiduciary responsibilities of an ERISA asset owner are such that will permit it to in effect narrow somewhat the range of its investments to achieve these kinds of objectives. I think we're moving beyond that question, and I think there's a possibility that this can take off.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thanks very much, everybody.